A new report by Bain and Company suggests Southeast Asia's green economy may be nearing a critical turning point. While climate ambitions remain strong, there is a widening gap between green investments being announced and projects actually being delivered on the ground. CNA's Ilakia Selvaraj joins us from Marina Bay Sands, where the first day of Ecosperity Week is underway. Ella, can you unpack what the report is warning us just about and why this gap between ambition and delivery matters for Southeast Asia's green economy?
Yes, Grace. So what the report is really pointing to is really a delivery gap. On paper, Southeast Asia's green economy has strong potential, but it's really projected to reach around $430 billion by 2030. But Bain and Company's warning is that the region cannot rely on ambition alone. Many governments and companies have announced climate targets, renewable energy plans, and green investments, but the report suggests that many of these are still not moving fast enough into actual projects, whether it is renewable power grid, infrastructure, transition financing, a cleaner transport, or nature-based solutions as well. Now, to unpack this further, I am now joined by Dale Hardcastle, partner at Bain and Company. Dale, thank you so much for joining us today.
Great to be here.
You know, this report that's released by Bain & Company is not the first report that is suggesting that Southeast Asia is off track in terms of green investment. Why are we still seeing the same concerns right now? Why does it really matter at this point in time?
I think a great question. I think the first thing I would say is the green economy, I think, actually is on track to some extent. If we look at what the report shows, we can see that it's going to grow from 290 billion to 430 by sort of 2030. That's 6 to 7% per year, which is much, much higher than even the underlying economy. So I think there's much to be positive about that. I think the challenge is really that we're seeing a bit of a disconnect between how different sectors and different segments of it are growing. Between those that have a lot of commercial momentum and the right market structure, green energy for data centers, EVs, and sort of other things, versus other sectors that are sort of lagging. And the challenge for the next 5 years is really how do we sort of close that gap between the two?
Yeah, the report says that Southeast Asia's green economy could reach $430 billion by 2030. It also warns that the region is at a very critical turning point. So is the region really still on track to capture this opportunity, or is it starting to lose momentum?
So I think the question is really how much can we realize that sort of potential? One of the things that we did this year was really go back and look at following the money. Since ultimately targets are important, but the targets that we deliver and the money that we sort of invest is what really matters at the end of the day. If we look at kind of what's been announced just in the grid and within sort of EVs, we can see that nearly $500 billion of new capex has been sort of announced towards the end of the decade. It's a pretty material number. But if we only continue to sort of fall prey to the constraints of the past, we see that the region loses about 35% of what's been planned, which is nearly double what we see in sort of other regions. So pretty sort of significant sort of gap between the two. But if we're able to address some of the constraints around markets, policies, and other things, we should be able to convert, I think, a lot more of that economic prize for the region and then have that cascade through into climate impact as well.
Yeah, speaking of gaps, we are looking at the announced investments and also the projects actually delivered on the ground. How serious is this gap that we are referring to? What really happens if it continues to grow?
Well, I think as I said, the green economy is doing well, but we could do so much better. And we could certainly also unlock many, many other sectors. I think one of the things that we talk about this year that's quite important is the grid. The grid, of course, is in the news everywhere as we sort of look at what's happening with data centers and sort of the expansion of sort of power, energy security concerns, and sort of other things sort of today. And the grid is, I think, really the choke point that opens up a lot of the other sort of green economy sectors. And looking at it, we can see this really significant gap between the amount that we invest and what needs to be done. If we're able to channel, I think, more investment into some of these things, we can probably, shrink half of that 35% gap that we sort of talked about and open up a lot more capital and sort of investment across all these sectors.
Yeah, you keep telling me that we're still fine. We just have a bit more of a room for improvement in that sense. If climate ambition still continues to remain strong, then why is delivery still so slow? What is the blockage?
Well, I think that leads to the bigger question, which everyone is sort of talking about today, which is, what is happening with the green economy and climate targets in a world where we're also balancing energy security, the Strait of Hormuz, all these other sort of concerns, as well as trade and sort of investment and sort of growth. And I think what's really sort of changed is really and that's why we call the report the new calculus this year, is there's been a bit of a shift as governments and sort of companies and others are having to balance a much more complex set of factors between climate and other things. And I think really, as we sort of look at sort of going forward, the mindset that's going to sort of hold is really trying to hold together two inconvenient truths. One on the one hand, that meeting these climate targets is going to be very important, but also driving economic growth and sort of welfare at the sort of same time. And somehow the region is going to need to kind of like bring these sort of two things together to strike a pragmatic balance with difficult choices and trade-offs.
Absolutely. And many companies are actually making net zero commitments at this point in time. But how serious do you think are they in terms of investing in this transition?
So I think there's two different things. Companies are very serious about investing in the green transition. If the opportunities are there, I don't think there's a question of capital, it's a question of execution and conversion. I would say there's probably greater pragmatism today on climate targets and sort of what those sort of goals are, net zero 2030 and other things. We've already heard several companies, here this week talk about the fact that they may need to sort of adjust and recalibrate those targets from the leaders all the way sort of on down. So I think it's pragmatism that is really going to be needed, and striking, growth first, energy affordability, and sort of other things, but then finding a way to also bring along those climate targets with it.
Yeah, I think you're spot on when you say pragmatism, right? And this year's Ecosperity theme is innovation to intent. So my question to you is, what would prove that Southeast Asia is actually moving in the right direction to bring ambition to action?
Well, look, I think there's a few things that are doing really well, right? For instance, one of the big surprises of the last few years has been what's happening with EVs. EVs, we're really sort of, I think, winning the battle on adoption, maybe doing a little bit less on sort of, capturing sort of value. If you look at the region, 4 of the top sort of 15 sort of markets in the world in terms of EV penetration are here, which we would never expected a few years before. But the challenge is, how much value do we actually sort of capture when a very small percentage of that is manufactured here and the broader sort of value? So I think epitomizes in some ways the challenge of the green economy for the region of how do we, on the one hand, move very, very quickly to take these new technologies and other things on board, but at the same time capture more of that economic value from minerals to batteries to EV manufacturing, and not just sort of take new technologies from the board.
Absolutely. I think we just have to wait and see how everything turns, not just being laid on paper, but also comes into practical use itself. Thank you so much for joining me and answering all these questions. I was speaking to Dale Hardcastle, partner at Bain & Company.